Okay. So we will just give a small introduction about this problem. So most of you do what we call as defense or offense, but it is often we do not speak about how do you attribute your attack to a nation state actor. And most of you are also familiar about this MITRE attack framework, or someone call it MITRE. It gives you names like this group was responsible for this is the malware used by that group, and so on and so on. And it is always interesting for me to look at nation state actors and say, how do people actually attribute a particular campaign or a malware or a process or a technique to a nation state actor? Non-state actors complicate this to quite a bit, but the process is essentially the same. You attach some campaign to an actor. The actor may be named A, B, C, D, doesn't matter. But how do people do that? And what's the process they follow in order to name that? That is the most interesting part for me. There is also an element of doctrine in the sense that countries approach this problem very differently. Nation-state agencies look at it and say, do we do it correctly? Is this how we operate? Are there some kind of patterns on it? And those are things that we're going to discuss about. Yeah. So my first question to John is, how do you attribute a particular campaign to an actor or a malware to an actor? What's the process?
Okay. I might first start by explaining how we name our actors. We changed our naming approach this year. I might explain that first and then talk about the attribution process. For nation-state actors, we've long named them after elements on the periodic table. There's strontium, aka AP28, aka Fancy Bear, a Nobelium, and we moved to naming after a taxonomy based on weather this year, where we'll have a family name like Blizzard, and Blizzard will refer to, there'll be a prefix before it, that'll refer to any threat actor that we attribute to from a nation-state perspective to Russia, and we have similar names for other countries as well. Part of the reason for this move was there's a real richer tapestry of actors that organizations are concerned about. Not only nation state, that's one. Cybercrime, that's another. Another category that we call private sector offensive actors. There's like NSO Group and other organizations that are private entities that make tools that are used in cyber. And then influence operators. So there's this richer tapestry, and we wanted to move to a scheme that made it more consistent and fit them into a framework that we could expand over time. And then from a practical perspective, if you are a customer and you search for zinc, zinc is a North Korean actor in our old taxonomy. You search for the word zinc, you'll probably find sunscreen and not the actor. So we wanted more relevant context when you search. And like I said, practically speaking, we track over 160 threat groups we link to nation-state activity. If you remember from chemistry class, how many elements are there on the periodic table? There's only 118 elements. So we were going to run out of those pretty soon. So that's the reason we expanded to this. Now, to get to your question of how we do attribution, I'd say there's three types of attribution in general that we follow. One is that most organizations don't need to know who is actually behind the attack in terms of what organization they're formally a part of, whether they wear a uniform or not, what building they go to work in and do that cyber thing. But they need to understand what threat group that is so they can defend against that threat group from a cyber perspective. So they need to understand what kind of malware and capabilities do they have? What type of infrastructure do they typically have? And then from a victim perspective, what sectors do they generally target? So how does the actor present from a motivation and technical capability to defend against them? And so much of our attribution is linking groups to giving them names purely for that reason. Sometimes we will attribute a group to a name, and then a law enforcement or intelligence community organization will formally attribute that to an actual named organization around the world. And so we may say that SolarWinds was perpetrated by an actor we called Midnight Blizzard or Nobelium, and then the United States government and the British government come out and say that's the Russian SVR, for example. And if we continue to track these actors, you have kind of a correspondence of attribution. And the third case is where we have enough visibility over the entire kill chain of the adversary to actually say with our own confidence level that we have some, like most organizations only see victim side. They only see within their walls what's happening. But as a cloud provider, a major platform vendor, security company that's Microsoft, we have a lot broader visibility, and many of our tech peers do as well. And so we can assemble sometimes a much greater picture about what's going on, including into adversary, operational range and so forth, further upstream to the attack and gain higher confidence that we believe or assess that an attack is coming from an actor. And maybe lastly, I would say is when we blog about attribution, our approach is to use what we call cyber estimative language. And so we don't say it's X. We'll assess with a certain confidence level various things. So we'll assess with moderate confidence on one aspect, or we may assess with high confidence that we believe this actor maps to an entity, but we may assess with moderate confidence what they may do over the next 6 months based on the targeting pattern that we've seen.
Okay. So the next question I have to ask you, do you agree that as a defender you don't care about who's behind it as a nation state actor? What do you really care about at the operational level?
Yeah, so at the first level, the immediate response, at that level, we don't care who is it. The first is always how can we contain it or how can we stop it from spreading or, doing the maximum damage. After that, for the long-term purpose, or if you have to report, then probably you need a better data set. At that level, immediately after the containment, then for the next level and for the long-term protection, we definitely are interested in who is behind it, what are their modus operandi, what kind of tools or technologies or malwares they use. So we go to the next level only after the initial containment. But again, forensically, collecting the logs or the evidences is very important at the first stage itself. But in the long run, the attribution is important for organization.
Do you care about adjacency operations? Like this organization got hit by this actor and there is a whole bunch of organizations that are going to be around like that, and hence it is interesting to you?
Yeah, so it depends on from what perspective I'm talking. So from a community perspective, if you ask, yes, we do share information to all the concerned people. But as an organization, if you ask, I don't think any organization shares these information to others in the industry, even though there are guidelines or requirements from the certain or other organizations that you have to report within 6 hours. I don't know the practical aspect of it, but to the peer industry organizations, I don't think any organization is sharing that.
Okay.
Except for cloud organizations or threat intel companies who have a contract or a relationship.
Okay. So you're saying intelligence sharing doesn't happen by default?
By default, it doesn't. Practically.
Okay. You mentioned about ransomware operators as a separate thing. How bad it has been? Because of late, people are more worried on the operational side with ransomware operators than actually nation-state actors.
Yeah, I would say really ransomware changed everything. If cyber espionage has always been something that certain parts of the private sector and the government sphere have had to deal with. And the early companies involved in threat intelligence and these kind of systems started to percolate. But the fact that ransomware was so disruptive and it was really targeting any kind of organization from a school to a university to a hospital to manufacturing to a casino, that broad basis and how disruptive the operations were to organizations has really changed the game, and I'd say has done more to deepen investment into cybersecurity practices than probably any other threat phenomenon that we've seen. Because for cyber espionage attacks, oftentimes they didn't disrupt the organization's ability to conduct whatever business they were doing. Indeed, they were not intended to do that. They were just intended to do information collection. And increasingly of late, we've seen ransomware operators get into a data extortion racket where they will prove that they have hacked into a company by leaking internal information, often customer data, because they know those organizations are more sensitive to customer data leaking, and they will selectively leak more data over time to create pressure for them to pay. And so I do think in a long ways ransomware changed the game for an organization, for organizations around the globe, and it's definitely one of the number one risks that they have to worry about.
Okay. In India, how does ransomware work? I've heard stories about companies getting breached, but they would not report it. They would eventually pay it up and cover it up because they're always worried about public image problems. And I've often seen denial is the first response. And what's been your experience and take on that?
So I've seen three, I'll classify it into three broad categories. One is, the company don't want to pay that much amount or they cannot afford to pay that much amount. So they go with whatever backup data they have. That's the first category that I've seen. The second is they pay. Again, you can classify that into two. They get the data back. Second is they don't get the data back. The third one that I've seen recently is the company wanted to pay and they wanted to pay the right way. So there are certain protocols in India, if I'm not wrong, where you have to report it to CERT, and then the payment that you are initiating, it has to be approved or it has to be informed to which wallet you are doing, and all those some certain procedures are there, which that time it took more than 3 or 4 days, and the threat actor or the adversary was not ready for giving that much time. And then they didn't follow the official path, and then they directly paid and all those things. So you see three categories. One is you don't pay. Second is you pay. The third is you want to pay the official way or the way directed by the government, but it takes a lot of time to get the clearance and all those things. So again, people, they just skip that and directly pay and then close the issue.
Okay.
So yes, it is still active. The ransomware is pretty much active now.
Okay. I'll ask you another controversial question, particularly about the AIMS breach, which I had written about. It was a very hilarious, or I would say problematic thing, where for months, a critical infrastructure system, which held records of the Prime Minister and his entire cabinet, was breached. It was ransomware, it was locked, and there had been statements issued that the backup was not functional, the secondary backup was infected. What really happened to that? Do you have any insights about it?
I won't be able to comment because I can comment only on the things that I've, that I personally know. But yes, from the publicly available information, a proper business continuity plan or operational continuity plan was not there. Is clearly evident. Otherwise, you could have restored it with, if you had a standard SOP and all those things, you could have returned to operation probably within 24 hours. But it prolonged for more than, I think, 3 or 4 days. And data leakage was there. A lot of other issues were there. So I think that was a learning experience for the critical sector, if you include the medical or the healthcare in critical sector.
Okay. Based on whatever you've read, what do you think was the motivation of the attacker? Because is it ransomware? Is it espionage? Is it really what?
So I think it's something related to the image of the country. That's the primary goal. And it's definitely, I think, personally speaking, from what I could gather, it's a state-sponsored activity only. State-sponsored or at least state-supported. I won't say state-sponsored, state-supported. There is a difference between state-sponsored and state-supported, where you don't have the direct blessings of the state. So it is, I believe it's a state-supported activity.
Okay. I will ask a different question to you, particularly on the state-sponsored versus state-supported. People have often told us about Conti and all the Lockbed and all those guys. And we also looked at North Koreans who had specialized in this kind of activity, particularly for stealing money in order to fund their own internal challenges around sanctions. How do you have a classification when you're modeling about state-sponsored, state-assisted, state-blessed? I mean, is that classification even worth it?
Well, I think all those elements you said factor into it. If we believe it is a cyber threat actor that is associated to the state, then we'll use our nation-state taxonomy.
Mm-hmm.
Though we recognize that some nation-state threat groups that we have tracked over time have also engaged in their own nighttime activities for personal enrichment. And so there's an actor that we used to track as Barium, which was an actor based in China, and they would do, during the daytime, traditional geopolitical cyber espionage targeting, and then at nighttime would target gaming companies notoriously and hack them to get gold and other digital currencies that those games had and have had a way to profit off of that. So we have seen, kind of a combination of those things. It's not very common, but we have seen it. Mm-hmm. I would say in general, there has been a direction to professionalize the cyber ranks among countries, cyber groups in them, reorganize them in some cases, get better lines of how they operate and whatnot and modernize them, but we still see it from time to time.
So in terms of morning for the state and evening for myself is how you would see some of these groups operate?
I mean, I wouldn't put North Korea in that site. We would just link most of their cryptocurrency stealing and the exchanges that they hack to the nation-state threat actor activities. But, where a cyber espionage group would be targeting organizations for personal enrichment, it's just counter to what a day job would be about for them.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Okay. You have tracked some of the power sector attacks recently that came, or probably 1 year ago?
Yes. A small research or some data collection.
Some data collection
from
around
the publicly available sources.
And what do you think would be the motivation of the actors who work on that?
So in that case, it's basically collecting the data as much as possible. And is there a possibility for disruption? As these are the two, points that I would categorize the motive behind these attacks. One is the collection of data, or the confidential data. And is there a possibility for a breach, or are we only targeting the outer ring of the network, or are they able to get into the core network? Those kind of study recce is what we could find. Yeah.
And there was an article in NY Times about, right around the time of Galwan, about Mumbai suffering a blackout, power breach.
Yes.
And it was attributed, it was a very difficult one, if I remember it.
Yes. Recorded
Future said it is a China-based actor.
Yes.
And New York Times wrote a big article. They said that China basically said lights out if you mess around with Galwan. But then Recorded Future didn't come back and said, but we never said that.
Yes.
What do you think about that?
So that particular incident, there is no evidence. There is no evidence that it was a targeted attack, except these, media newses and all those things. There was no discussion on the darknet or any of the discussion forums on this. So that personally, I think it wasn't a targeted one. Probably a technical glitch. This again, my personal opinion.
And which brings to the next question. Do you really attach a lot of neutral value towards these reports by cybersecurity companies? Because that gets often asked.
So if you are a true security person, I believe you should never trust any input. You have to always double verify. So there are always biases, because intelligence, as we discussed, it's always biased. So biased in the sense for the particular organization, they only look at that particular stream of inputs that they are interested in. So these reports, I won't say we totally believe it. We always look for what is the supporting evidence. If let's say Times Now or any organization say these are the parameters. So we always look for, on what basis they are saying this, or is there any evidence or any discussion that is happening, or any indicators, anything is available. So straight away, we generally don't trust these sources.
Okay. He mentioned two possible motivation for the recent breaches on power sectors or activities in power sectors. You had worked on some of the Wall Typhoon kind of a thing where there was targeted on critical infrastructure. What do you think would be the motivation? And in general, how do you classify these activities?
Yeah, so when we recently released a blog on this actor based in China called Volt Typhoon, and part of what we observed is penetrations into a number of United States, Guam-based critical infrastructure organizations, including telcos, ports, and water treatment facilities and things like that. And part of the reason that we blogged about it was, besides the broad pattern that we saw, where clearly it looked like a campaign with intent was happening, which meant there was more likely happening than what we were just seeing. And so by publishing, we could encourage others to use that, help put the fuller picture together, as well as for people that would be targeted by it on an ongoing basis to understand what we had seen. But one of the particular elements of concern was when organizations are targeted for cyber espionage, it's often because they have information. That is the goal of collection. But some critical infrastructure targets really have no information value. And like, for example, I would say like one of the targeting that we saw was at a water company. And that a water company has no data that's of interest to an attacker. It only has disruptive potential. And we've certainly seen in disruptive attacks, say between Iran and Israel, where we see different organizations targeted purely for disruptive actions, or in Ukraine as well, where we see the nature of the victim is not one that really has any espionage purpose other than potential disruptive effects. Like another example there might be, it's been long standing that airline reservation systems are a target of cyber espionage because law enforcement and intelligence organizations around the globe want to be able to track the movement of individuals. And so they're always in the crosshairs. But air traffic control systems, a very different kind of target than that, and that would be something that would be more of disruptive objective. And now the why behind these, clearly there's the general geopolitical backdrop with U.S. and China and Taiwan. Why exactly this is happening, I don't think we have any particular crystal ball to do other than reporting on what we're seeing and allowing that to add to the overall picture.
Okay. Are activities related to geopolitics? Are activities related to geopolitics? Increase and decrease?
Yes, I would say, let me talk about the activities towards India in the last month. So all of you know about the G20 happened. So there was Op India, I don't know how many of you are aware of it. There was an Indonesian group who was targeting Indian websites from 9 to 10 September. They did a massive attack on Indian infrastructure, and in fact, I informed Antariksh also that there is a possibility of them targeting the conference websites also. So I don't know how many of you noticed that the Delhi police and Mumbai police website was down. There's no attribution that it was because of the Op India campaign by the Indonesian hackers. But yes, anything happens anywhere nowadays. There is a underlying cyber activity happening. You look at the latest Poland rail attack, which is not cyber, but it is basically radio frequency based. Again, it is related to the geopolitical situation. MGM attack, I'm not sure how do you attribute it, whether it is a state-sponsored, state-supported, but except these are the three main attacks that happened in the last 1 month. So out of this three, two is basically geopolitical.
Okay. I remember distinctively there was a cyber attack on Sony which brought down because they were trying to put a movie on Kim Jong-un, right? And so people always ask that, am I a target because of my politics?
Well,
organizations.
I'd say that is not the majority case, but we have certainly seen cases where North Korea, as you mentioned, that there was one there. We also saw some where Iran particularly struck targets with destructive attacks because of the affiliation of and maybe the outspokenness of the executive team or the CEO of that company to make an example out of it or that kind of thing. usually against targets who have no ability to fight back because they're private sector organizations or whatnot. It's the other, I would say, domain of where your political opinions potentially get you into the crosshairs in cyber is in the realm of dissidents, activists, journalists that are in contact with those and have a network. That is the space that we see also getting targeted with spyware and things related to that. And there's been numerous reporting in the in this area of what we call private sector offensive actors that make tools and sell them to governments, and then and how the governments use them is probably at least somewhat opaque to the developer and seller of those tools. And so, and how what the rule of law in that country is where they sell them to and how they're used. I would say that's the thing that was a bit of a Wild West maybe 6 or 7 years ago when those tools started to appear. And then as it was revealed that they were used in various attacks against journalists and others, countries started to require export licenses for those tools to be sold outside of their country's borders and did some work to sort of curtail where they would sell, but it's still an area that I think we expect to see a lot of stories to come out.
Okay. I will ask a different question about 0 days, which is, you found something as part of your work. Would you report to CERT or would you sell it?
That's a very interesting question. It depends on my... Okay, so practically speaking, let me not put it on me. Let me talk about the circle that I know.
Yeah.
99% of them, they will sell it only. They'll not report to CERT.
Okay. And
I'm talking practically.
Fair enough. I mean, why does that asymmetry exist?
Because of the financial, the gains.
Okay.
Sell it in the sense, let me say, sell it in the proper channel.
Okay.
Not in the darknet, probably.
Okay. And and you're saying it's purely because of asymmetric financial gains, right?
Because see, if you're talking about patriotism or nationalism and all those things, which is fine, which is good, but I've seen people, you check with any of the people who are hiring, their primary priority is a good company, a good salary package, and a good working atmosphere.
Okay.
So, if it is not 0 days, or if it, let's say, vulnerabilities that we see, if we see a problem, we definitely will report it. But see, you can report it, and then, take a protective action. But when it is 0 day, it is not, we are not talking about lakhs of rupees, we are talking about crores of rupees.
Okay. How does countries deal with this problem? Nation-state agencies, because all nation-state actors have both the offensive and defensive side, and they find something, and I've seen in the past they've reported quite a bit of it to Microsoft. How do they basically go about doing it? What's the process? Where they decide to keep it to themselves or just tell it to the vendor and say, now go patch it?
Yeah, it may be best to talk about it in sections. So we've seen an official recognition by some governments that they shouldn't hold on to all the vulnerabilities that they know about and build a big arsenal of them. That some of the biggest cyber powers also, their country is profoundly dependent on the security of information technology. And there is some decision making that should be done about whether a vulnerability should be held onto or whether it should be disclosed. And so in the United States, they have a process called the Vulnerability Equities Process, VEP. We're not part of it as a private sector entity, but I can tell you that we have had vulnerabilities reported to us through that process that we then go fix and put out with Patch Tuesday, and you name it. And we have had some other governments also report vulnerabilities to us, because many of them also, as you mentioned, have information assurance arms. And their information assurance arms are there to make sure that the technology, the government, and then critical areas of the economy are safe and secure. And so they will look about what the defaults are and whether things have been implemented properly, because they also want to be able to recommend, to be able to use software in certain configurations that are more secure. So they have an impetus to make sure it is secure in their reviews of it and so forth. So I also know that sometimes governments come across 0 days, not that they have developed, but that they have found in use. And they will disclose those to vendors, in effect, to burn them against whoever the adversarial nation is in that case. And usually that vulnerability, if it's being used by some government that is adversarial in cyber, that also means it's probably aimed at their own domestic companies, and therefore there's a vulnerability around that.
Okay. So you said you have private offensive state actors, and I've come across citizen labs, which makes a point of burning all NSOs 0 days and whatnot. How exactly do you see the role of a state actor? In my head, it is about a buffer state in geopolitics, but on the cyber domain, would you categorize it, or would you say the private actors as differently?
When you say the private actors, you mean like the citizen labs?
Citizen labs, kind of.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of think of them as they're in a specialized domain in this threat intelligence sphere. And they cover a certain sector area that is, I'd say, by its nature, going to be underserved by enterprise security companies that naturally sell to large organizations. In their case, they may be, people they're working with are just individuals that have essentially no resources to investigate IT security and so forth. So they play a very important role in that sense. And they also have to gain great trust with whoever they're working with, and they have been able to do that effectively. So, we find their efforts to uncover campaigns, work with, they recently worked with Google on some vulnerabilities that affected Android and iOS, and we think very highly of that work.
Yeah. What has been your experience with respect to private offensive actors?
Private offensive
actors?
Globally? There are many players still, there are many operating from various parts across the globe. Some of them are publicly available on the darknet for you to interact with and get a POC or a demo. Some of the countries, they have changed their policies on selling the offensive tools. Now, I don't want to name the country, but one particular country has seen that you cannot directly deal with any private organization now. You have to go through the government entities only. So things are changing. A lot of change happened in the last 9 months, I would say. But there are, if there is a demand, there is a supply.
Okay. What about for red teams? Like, by very nature of the job, you're supposed to actually conduct offensive hacking with your client's permissions. And how do we go about doing it if you're saying everything is going to be licensed and restricted?
So red teaming is basically objective set. First, you set the objective. It is not a blanket clearance to do whatever you want. You have a particular set of objectives set. Let's say data exfiltration or lateral movement. So for that particular activity, you have enough tools which is publicly available, or you can custom make it. What you're talking about is, or the initial question was more on 0-day attacks or a 0-click attack, which is not required generally for a red teaming activity.
Okay.
So there's a difference between
that.
The first question and the red teaming activities.
Okay. And what about defensive side? Like, do you see an ecosystem of private offensive actors in India developing, in progress?
Yeah, a lot of. You look at the last 2 years also, a lot of new initiatives or new firms have come up with a lot of new innovative ideas and all those things. How effective it is, only time will tell. But yes, we have new concepts, you have new approaches towards defense coming up.
Some time ago, China used to run this CTF or Pony kind of competition, and they would then, once it got to a particular reputation level, they said, find the bug and report only to the MSS.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so you see a state blessing turning into an industry which the state supported, and the state is now rolling it into itself, thus creating an industrial complex. Do you see a trend in India where the government is encouraging more cyber offense or more cyber defense? What do you see the trend?
I would use the word offense and defense. I would say capability. That is the very neutral word I can use, because cyber capability includes both defense and offensive. So you cannot do defense without offensive.
You can't differentiate? You can't distinguish?
You can differentiate, but what I am saying is, if you want to master offensive, you need to be good at defensive, because if you look at the art of war, it says when you are attacking, you should be strong like a mountain. So something like that. If you want to do offensive, you should be very good with your defenses. And if you want to protect, you should know your adversary well. Okay. So I would say, yes, there is a defense and offense classification, but from a national perspective, I would say cyber capability is the one term that we should concentrate.
Do you see a push to develop cyber capabilities?
Definitely.
Has increased in the last decade?
Yes. If you look at from a national perspective, DSA itself did a hackathon challenge, and so many companies participated. New innovative ideas came out. Even G20 also, there were a lot of IT-related discussion, showcasing happening. There is a push. How effective is the push? Only time will tell.
Okay, right. Which brings back to the question that I had about Snowden. Did things radically change before and after Snowden disclosures on countries' push to develop their own cyber capabilities?
Yeah, I think Snowden was a big wake-up call for many countries in cyber to understand the sophistication of what had been developed. And I think we definitely have seen many more countries try to up their game in terms of cyber capabilities afterwards. Some of that probably would have happened anyway. That's just the nature of how important the cyber domain is to today's world. But I do think the revelations had a role to understand just how sophisticated capabilities were abroad, that they were, and to sort of have other companies understand they need to catch up. After that, we did see this development of these private sector offensive actor companies, and it takes a long time for a country to build a cyber program, to have the talent, to have the feeder of talent, to get and so forth. And these private sector companies are really allowing organizations to skip several years in advance because they can just buy the capability.
Okay. How did cryptography and cryptanalysis initially power the Western countries' cyber capabilities?
Well, I mean, if I interpret your question, like most of the organizations that today we think of as cyber originally have their roots into eavesdropping and cracking communications of their adversaries. And so that goes into the realm of cryptanalysis and protecting communications, as well as being able to intercept and break communications. And this goes back to World War II, and forward. And so those tended to be the agencies that had the wizards, the technical wizards, that as communication became digitized, electronic systems and whatnot, that's where the people and expertise existed. And so I think as that turned into IT, that's why we see cyber have kind of its origin story in many of those SIGINT agencies there.
Okay.
Do you see? Time is over.
Time's over.
You can
okay.
Get into the Q&A.
Yeah. So I think we are largely covered to some extent what we had wanted. We can take questions. Anyone can ask questions. Whatever you want.
Thank you for the nice discussion. My name is Rishi. I'm from Mandiant Google. So a couple of things. When we do some assessments with companies, we have seen there is often a hurry to attribute it, either to a point wherein they want to know who did it, or they want to dull the blow and say it was an APT actor, we could not have done anything. So to use it as an excuse, have you seen in other parts of the world wherein there's a pressure coming in from the impactful clients, like, who did it? Tell us quickly. We want to go to the board.
I don't know that I would say I've seen it as a reason to have an excuse publicly. I mean, when we see an attack, it's important for us to link it to some threat actor we know about or don't know about. We often have these clusters of unknown. Mandy would call them an UNC. We call them now storm groups, and that's clusters of uncategorized activity. But in order to stay on top of and track actor activity, it's just natural for us to, where we can, link it to something known if we were able to do that. Whether a company wants to go public with it, we've probably seen both sides of that. One, where a company doesn't want to get involved in geopolitics at all. Maybe they're a telco, and many telcos are essentially national telcos, and they don't want to enter that sphere at all. And other companies that they're happy to do it as long as it is not them saying it, and it is a Microsoft or somebody else. They're okay with it, I would say.
Okay. Anyone else?
Hello. Hi. Yeah. At the back. Yeah. Hi. I work as a threat intelligence researcher at CloudSec. What we see is government forces every company to secure themselves, but then at the forefront, it's government companies which get attacked and impacted the most. Like, their infra is the least secure infra we ever see. So what's your point of view on that?
I won't go with a blank statement like all government networks are weak and all the corporates are strong. No, there are a mix of it. But yes, there are government networks which still uses non-NIC email IDs, which is very common now. Also, you can see at least at the state government levels. And there are so many, private sector or enterprise corporates, which even personally, most of you who are in audits, you might see email passwords not changed for the last 4 years also. So there are instances like this, which is a mix and match. A blanket point of saying all government networks are weak. Personally speaking, I don't, or we can't agree to it, because some of our networks are pretty strong. Yes, there are weaknesses in networks. So probably the reporting of the government breaches are more public now. Probably that could be the reason why we have we feel that, or we think that the government networks are weak. I hope I answered your point.
Thank you, panelists, for such an insightful discussion. Please give them a huge round of applause.
Thank you.